In my previous life, I shamelessly chased after the school hunk. On the day I died of incurable cancer, he held a grand wedding with his white moonlight. Having a second chance at life, I went back to the day when I confessed my love to him. In front of everyone, I slapped a love letter right onto the school bully's desk. The white-haired school bully opened his eyes in his sleep and looked at the love letter full of hearts, ? I said, "It's for you, scratch paper." There was dead silence in the classroom. The white-haired guy in front of me slowly raised his head, revealing a face that was extremely aggressive. His eyebrows were sharp, and his nose was high and straight. There was also a silver earring on his right earlobe. It was really stylish that I heard a few gasps from around me. I didn't know if it was because of being amazed or scared. I remembered him, Roy. It was rumored that if you randomly picked 3 school buildings, one of them was donated by his family. So he was not only respectfully called Brother Roy. He also had another nickname, Building Brother. A boy beside him joked, "Brother Roy, you're so cool. Love has come to our class?" Roy chuckled and told him to get lost. His tone was lazy and affectionate. After scolding him, he turned to look at me again. "What do you want?" I said matter-of-factly, "I want to sit next to you. Is that okay?" A few more gasps were heard around me. This time, I could tell that it was shock. Roy propped his head up and had a half-smiling expression on his face. "I never let anyone sit beside me. What makes you think you can?" Our eyes met, and neither of us would give in. I gritted my teeth. No way. There was no other choice. There were only 2 empty seats left in the elite class. If I didn't sit next to him, I'd have to sit with Hank. What was the difference between that and courting death? I simply put down my school bag and sat down directly, playing the rogue. Seeing this, Roy impatiently frowned, as if he was going to drag me out in the next second. I've already said. Before he could finish speaking, I pressed his leg under the desk. Roy's expression suddenly froze. I said in a voice that only the 2 of us could hear, "Please, let me sit next to you. Otherwise, I'll have to sit with Hank. You don't even know that he's actually a pervert. When there's no one else in the class, he likes to crawl in the dark on the floor. He also likes to steal girls' skirts. I had no choice because my skirts were stolen so many times that it didn't matter. Anyway, Hank couldn't hear it. Even if he did, it didn't matter. He deserved it. The more I talked, the more excited I became. With every sentence I said, the strength in my hand increased a bit. With every bit of force, Roy's face became gloomier. The face that was still half smiling just now couldn't even hold a smile anymore. In the end, his face was so dark that it seemed like water could drip from it. Almost gritting his teeth, he spat out a word, "Okay." I felt strange in my heart. Wasn't he still looking arrogant just now? How did he suddenly become so easy to talk to? Also, what was with that expression of having to bow one's head under someone else's power? Wait, were his thighs a bit too thin? And they were so soft. "Are you still pinching?" Roy finally couldn't bear it anymore. I quickly withdrew my hand. That wasn't his thigh. I really just used the Emperor to order others around. After the class division, Hank blocked me in the corridor. "What's going on between you and Roy?" I didn't want to get too entangled with him and simply threw out a sentence, "None of your business." Hank probably didn't expect that I would choke him like this and immediately frowned. He stretched out his arm and blocked my way. "Lindsay, Roy isn't someone you can mess with. How could you send him a love letter?" Hearing this, combined with all the things in my previous life, my temper flared up at once. "Whether I mess with him or not is my business. What does it have to do with you? No matter how bad he is, he's still better than some people who keep others hanging, neither accepting nor refusing." Yes, if it hadn't been for Hank always giving me hope when I was about to give up in my previous life, making me mistakenly think that as long as I tried a little harder, I could win him over, I wouldn't have liked him for so many years. Hank's face suddenly looked very ugly. "Lindsay, what do your words mean?" I folded my arms and sneered. "It means I'm scolding you. Can't you tell?" Hank's face darkened again and again. Just as he was about to continue speaking, I didn't want to waste any more time with him. I spotted Roy not far away with sharp eyes and quickly waved my arm and shouted, "Brother Roy." Under everyone's gaze, Hank had to put down his arm and let me go. He finally said in my ear, "Lindsay, I'm very disappointed in you." I smiled at Roy while saying simply, "Get lost." When I ran to Roy's side, I smelled a faint smell of tobacco. "Did you just come back from smoking?" Roy gave a faint and then reached out and pressed his hand on my forehead, pushing me a long way away. His voice was hoarse and raspy. "Secondhand smoke is harmful to health. Don't smell it." I remembered that in my previous life, he only studied at number 1 middle school for 3 months, and the reason for his transfer seemed to be that he had health problems. "Somehow," I said, "first-hand smoke is also harmful to health. Could you stop smoking?" I looked at him eagerly. Sean behind him couldn't help it and joked, "You're already being henpecked before you've even caught up with Brother Roy." Hearing what he said, I realized how overstepping my request was. Roy didn't know what had happened in my previous life. In his eyes, I was just a girl he had known for less than a day, asking him to quit smoking. How strange. I mean, you can smoke less in the future. Two voices sounded at the same time. I was stunned. Ah? Roy clenched his right fist and pressed it against his lips, coughed softly. I won't smoke anymore in the future. Now it was my turn to be dumbfounded. The legendary school bully, so obedient? Hank's white moonlight was Joanna. In my previous life, she and I entered the elite class together. I didn't know that Hank liked her, so I sat beside him without worry. I didn't know that the seat was actually reserved by him for Joanna. No wonder Hank hated me so much later. Even after receiving my love letter, he said maliciously, "Oh, scratch paper." Back then, Joanna didn't dare to sit next to Roy, so she volunteered to sit beside the podium. As a result, there was more than half a class between this couple. Combined with the way Hank teased me in my previous life, he probably blamed me for this. Strangely enough, in this life, Joanna got to sit beside Hank as she wished, but he wasn't that enthusiastic about it anymore. Instead, he came to block me every day. Could this be the so-called distance makes the heart grow fonder? And I, in order to avoid Hank, could only stick to Roy every day. I almost followed him into the boys' toilet. Well, it was almost the same. Every time Roy got up, I would quickly ask, "Are you going to the toilet? I'll accompany you." Now, whenever I showed up at the entrance of the boys' toilet, a group of his little followers would tease me, "Hey, sister-in-law, are you here to accompany brother Roy to the toilet again?" Roy walked out, slapped Will on the head, with a lollipop slanted in his mouth, and said with narrowed eyes, "What are you talking about? Your Chinese is so rigid." Since he promised me that he would quit smoking, he really hadn't touched a cigarette again. Instead, he bought a bunch of lollipops from the school store. When he had a craving for cigarettes, he would put one in his mouth. I happened to see them once, and they were all strawberry flavored. He walked to my side with his hands in his pockets. "Let's go, little shadow." I blushed. "What kind of nickname is that? Don't call me that randomly." Roy bent down and smiled. "Don't you know what others in the school say about us? They say you're my child bride, that's why you follow me around all day." What the heck? Obviously, I'm just trying to avoid Hank. I was still silently justifying myself in my heart. Before I knew it, Roy took out a lollipop from his pocket, unwrapped it, and made an "ah" shape with his mouth. I was full of doubts, but I still opened my mouth. The sweet taste soon filled my whole mouth. It was strawberry flavored. Why suddenly, give me candy? Before I could finish asking, Roy had already turned around and slowly walked towards the classroom. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of Hank's fleeting figure, and I quickly chased after Roy. "Hey, wait for me." On this day, Hank blocked me at the stairway again. I pretended not to see him and was about to turn sideways and go up the stairs. But Hank blocked my way with a stack of notebooks. I said impatiently, "Move it away." Hank frowned and said softly, "These are the key points I've marked. The monthly exam is only a few days away. You can't do without these." I didn't reach out my hand. Instead, I suddenly raised my eyes and gave him a mocking look. After each class division, there would be a monthly exam. It was used to test whether the new classmates could keep up with the learning progress of the class and also to screen out those who got in by sheer luck. In my previous life, I begged Hank hard to help me mark the key points, but he refused. He said, "You were lucky to get into the elite class. Eventually, you'll have to go back. Why bother clinging on and refusing to leave?" He always thought that I was just someone who got in by luck, but he wouldn't believe that at that time. I really liked him so much that I studied as if my life depended on it. Later, I managed to stay in the elite class with the fifth lowest score. Everyone was surprised and guessed that Hank had tutored me. At that time, he didn't say a word in explanation. And now, I was avoiding him like he was a snake or a scorpion. He actually took the initiative to sort out the notes and bring them to me. I folded my arms and smiled. "It's not up to you to decide whether I can or not. On the surface, you seem to be doing it for my good, but your words are full of belittlement." Hank's expression froze, and then he sighed. "Don't just be tough with your words. The top priority now is to improve your grades." I rolled my eyes. "Can't you understand human language?" I said I don't need it. Hank reached out his hand, and it seemed that he was about to force the notebooks into my arms. And I naturally leaned back to avoid it, but I forgot that I was standing on the stairs at that moment. The sense of weightlessness came, and I subconsciously shouted, "Ah!" However, the expected pain didn't come. I fell into a strawberry-scented embrace. "Hiss, how long are you going to lie there?" I stared at Roy's face in a daze. It wasn't until he spoke that I realized that I had knocked him down. That loud noise just now was the sound of him landing on his back. Sorry." Roy stood up, twisted his neck, and said to Hank, "Still not leaving?" Hank's face turned completely dark. Without saying a word, he turned around and left. After all, he didn't dare to confront Roy head-on. After he walked away, Roy still stood there, silent. I felt a bit guilty and quickly said, shall we go back to the classroom first? Roy still hung his head, didn't move, and didn't say a word. I thought he was angry and hurriedly continued to explain, it was really him who came to block my way. Since you told me to avoid contact with him, I've been keeping away from him. I know. Roy interrupted me. He raised his head, and there wasn't the slightest sign of anger on his face. He pointed to his leg and said, could you help me to the infirmary? I think I sprained it. Me. I helped Roy with great effort and watched him hop down the steps one by one. However, did you really avoid him because you listened to me? Am I that important in your heart? One more word, and I'll push you down the steps. Roy sprained his ankle because of me. So it was only natural that the task of taking care of him fell on me. I fetched water for him. Brought meals for him. Asked for leave for him for physical education classes. And under his coercion, I also took my own leave so that I could accompany him in the classroom to relieve his boredom. During the break, Will looked at the snacks and fruits piled up on Roy's desk and exclaimed enviously, how nice. I should have limped too if I had known earlier. Roy chewed on an apple and glanced at him smugly, is your deskmate as nice as mine? Will's male deskmate, who was inexplicably mentioned, slowly raised his head, ? However, brother Roy, Will continued, what are you going to do when you go home? There's no one at home to take care of you. He swallowed the second half of the sentence back under Roy's dangerous gaze. I immediately thought of the rumors about him in my previous life. I heard that although Roy's family was wealthy, his parents cared very little for him. They often transferred Roy to another school because of work reasons, then left a large sum of money and didn't care about anything else. Although some classmates privately said things like, if I had that much money it wouldn't matter if my parents didn't care about me, I thought that for Roy himself, he must still be a bit sad. Thinking of this, I almost subconsciously said, I'll go to your home to take care of you. As soon as I said this, both Roy and Will were stunned. Will scratched his hair and said first, sister-in-law is so kind. But brother Roy has never let anyone go to his home. Okay. Roy interrupted him. I turned to look and saw a smile on his lips. He said to me slowly, you have to keep your word. No backing out. Roy's home was on the top floor of a building in the city center. Previously, I had only heard that the rent there was extremely high and it was rented by some startup companies. I didn't expect there to be residences there too. I carried the vegetables I had just bought, and Roy casually pointed to the kitchen, put them there. I looked around, searching for the apron. When I turned my head, I found that Roy had already put it on. His handsome yet somewhat ruffian face, paired with a pink lacy apron, looked quite cute. I was surprised and said, aren't I supposed to cook? Roy had already turned on the faucet and started washing the vegetables. He was also propping up his plastered leg, leaning against the sink, slightly frowning. He looked so serious as if he was having a duel with something. Oh, with the Chinese cabbage. Taking advantage of the free time, he opened a lollipop and put it in his mouth before saying vaguely, just kidding. How could I really let you cook? Today you can taste my cooking skills. I watched him skillfully turn on the stove, cut the shredded pork, and cut the vegetables. The surprise in my heart grew stronger, probably because my expression was too obvious. Roy chuckled, what? You thought I was a young master who never touched the spring water with his 10 fingers. I nodded very honestly. When the shredded pork was poured into the oil pan, there was a crackling sound. Roy said, you know my family is rich, right? They also call me Brother Lou. My parents are quite generous, but whenever I quarrel with them they cut off all my living expenses. They even told my relatives and friends not to lend me any money. Once we had a fierce quarrel and they ignored me for half a year. I couldn't even afford takeout. It was the neighbor aunt who took pity on me and gave me some food. Although I burned it in the end and didn't get to eat it. But since then I've learned to cook by myself. He turned around and smiled at me, so during that time I was so angry when I saw the buildings donated by them in the school that I wished I could sell them to buy food. His expression was calm, without much pain or anger, but I always felt that he wasn't very happy. Even that last joke was just to prevent the atmosphere from becoming more gloomy. I opened my mouth, not knowing how to comfort him for a moment. After all, every family has its own difficulties. Actually, I was just about to speak when my cell phone rang. Looking at the caller ID, I subconsciously frowned. After hesitating for a while, I still answered the call. What time is it? Why haven't you come home yet? Your brother wants to eat the desserts from Panji. Remember to buy some on your way back when you come home. Say something. Are you mute? I took a deep breath and hung up the call directly. Roy looked at my expression and asked in confusion, who was it? My dad. Oh. The air was silent for a few seconds. No one talked about this topic anymore. You still know to come back. When I opened the door, the living room was pitch dark. I had just groped to turn on the lights when I saw 3 figures sitting in the middle of the sofa. The man's undisguised anger filled the narrow space. It was also mixed with the smell of cheap cigarettes. I looked at them calmly and didn't intend to get entangled. Yeah, I'm back. Then I turned around and walked towards my own room. Stop right there. Unexpectedly, my indifference brought even greater anger. A glass cup whistled past my ear and blocked my way. Then it crashed into the wall with its smack and shattered into pieces instantly, the glass fragments scattered on the ground, reflecting my expression at this moment like a kaleidoscope. Numb, tired. My mother's voice came from behind. Lindsay, what's going on with you these 2 days? You've been coming back so late every day. There's no one to cook at home. Have you made some shady friends outside? Your father is also concerned about you. Come here and apologize to your father. I turned around and scanned these 3 family members. In my previous life, perhaps I would have been bewitched by my mother's gentle persuasion and walked up to apologize without thinking. But in this life, I had already keenly sensed the key point in her words. So, actually, she was just blaming me for not cooking at home, right? How ridiculous. It was just like when I got my cancer diagnosis in my previous life. When I called home, feeling helpless and scared, their first reaction was actually, you don't know when you'll leave. Why don't you tell your brother the password of your bank card first? Later, I donated all my property to the charity. They went crazy and ran to the hospital, even trying to drag me out of the hospital bed to change the will. You ungrateful wretch. You'd rather give it to strangers than to us. Your brother is getting married. The family urgently needs money. How could you just give it to others? It seemed that no one cared about my life that was already counting down. Perhaps from that moment, I knew that they had never loved me. Lacking love in my original family, I tried to find love from Hank. And because I had never seen what true love was like, I loved in a clumsy and embarrassing way. In my previous life, I was trapped in such a vicious cycle, which led to a lifetime of tragedy. I end this life. I clenched my fists. Speak up. Are you mute? Where's the pangy I asked you to bring? I think you've been fooling around with some wild man. You even forgot this. Ah. I picked up the cup beside me and threw it straight at them. An eye for an eye, fair enough. You'd better watch your mouth. Seeing that I dared to lay hands on their precious son, the other 2 couldn't sit still. Lindsay, I think you've gone too far. I'll teach you a good lesson today. The man rolled up his sleeves and stretched out his arm to grab me. Although the cup didn't hit his face, Axel, who was still startled, jumped on the spot and cursed. I've heard about it for a long time. She's been chasing men at school. What's his name? Hank. She doesn't even have the heart to study. Am I wrong? Isn't he a wild man? She even dared to hit me for a wild man. Goodness. I can't believe I raised such a shameless daughter. Look at me. The scene was in chaos. Before my father could grab me, I sidestepped and turned into my own room, and then slammed the door shut. Bang, was the sound of my head hitting the wooden door. Ouch. Lindsay, open the door for me. If you have the guts, don't come out for the rest of your life. How dare you? I locked the door from the inside and ignored the sound of banging on the door outside. After about 10 minutes, the banging on the door became louder and louder, and there was even the sound of a hammer hitting the door handle. If this continued, the door would be smashed open in less than 5 minutes. You choose for yourself. Either you come out by yourself or we'll smash the door down. I'll count to 3. 3, 2. I walked over and opened the door directly. You're sensible. My father might have thought that I opened the door because I was scared. After all, in this family, what I was most afraid of was the countdown. Because as long as the syllable 1 was pronounced, it meant that I was going to be beaten. So when he saw my calm eyes, he was so surprised that he got stuck. I dragged my suitcase and walked past them expressionlessly. My mother hurriedly shouted, Lindsay, where are you going? Axel sneered beside her, still playing the trick of running away from home. Do you think anyone in this family cares about you? Perhaps before, I would have been hurt by this malicious comment, but now I didn't care anymore. I turned around and said to them, the suitcase and the clothes in it were all bought with the money I earned from part-time jobs. Over the years, I worked to earn tuition fees and living expenses by myself, and I gave the rest to you. I don't think I owe you anything. But if the court decides in the future that I need to support you, I will pay the fees stipulated by the court. But before that, I hope we won't appear in each other's lives anymore. It's disgusting. With that, I dragged the small suitcase and walked out of the door. It's kind of ridiculous to say that after living in this family for over 10 years, when I finally left, I realized that all my clothes were actually bought with the money I earned by myself, and I didn't even have more than 5 sets of clothes in total. My words seemed to have stunned everyone. After walking for a while, bits and pieces of conversation came from behind. Lindsay, what are you talking about? Are you really leaving? Are you really so heartless that you don't want your mom and dad anymore? Why are you stopping her? I've said it long ago that daughters are just ungrateful wretches. What a load of nonsense about being a little sweetheart. Bah. Just let her go, Mom. I bet she won't last long without a place to stay. In the end, she'll come back with her tail between her legs. I held the handle of the suitcase and smiled. How long can I last? Well, let's just wait and see. The roads in the community were very dark, and the dim yellow streetlights elongated my figure. I stared at my own shadow and suddenly felt a bit lost in my heart. Admitting that your parents don't love you is really a difficult thing. Even if you know it's not your fault, you still can't help asking, is it because I'm not good enough that they love my younger brother more? No. I suddenly raised my head. The teenager was wearing a gray hoodie, with half of his body leaning against the streetlight pole whose paint was peeling off. The curling smoke blurred his cheeks, but his eyes were surprisingly bright. I stammered a bit, you? Why are you here? Didn't you get ready to go to bed when I left your home after dinner? Roy walked over and suddenly pulled me into his arms. His shoulders were broad and his embrace was warm. I leaned against his chest and listened to him speaking solemnly and earnestly. It's not your fault, Lindsay. You're great. It's their fault. So he had heard the words that I subconsciously said just now. I asked in a muffled voice, really? Roy rested his chin on my head and nodded seriously, really. Brother Roy never lies. My nose felt a bit sour. I really wanted to say, Roy, do you know that this is the first time that I've been chosen so firmly by someone? My lover in the previous life and my family all firmly gave up on me. I also wanted to say, Roy, cheesy love words are really cheesy, but thank you. I appreciate it, but after hesitating for a long time, the words that came out in the end were, Roy, didn't you promise me that you wouldn't smoke anymore? The warm embrace suddenly froze. The teenager who just seemed able to take on everything suddenly turned back into that naive high school student. He said in a low voice, when I saw your expression when you answered the phone today, I guessed that something bad was going to happen. I secretly followed you here and then heard the quarrel from your home. I was so agitated that, his voice was as soft as a mosquito's buzzing, I won't do it again next time. I looked up at his guilty and flickering eyes and suddenly smiled. Actually, he didn't need to promise me anything at all. My casual words couldn't really restrain him at all. But Roy still took that promise very seriously. So this is what it feels like to be valued. It means that even if you have nothing, there will still be someone handing you a handle on a silver platter. Roy's face felt hot under my gaze. He touched the tip of his nose and changed the topic. What are you going to do now? Do you want to come and stay at my place first? Sure. I readily agreed. Actually, the moment I walked out of the door, I was thinking about what to do next. In my current identity as a high school student, I have no source of income and no time to work part-time to earn money. The living expenses and meal fees are okay to deal with. After all, it doesn't cost much to eat in the cafeteria every day. But accommodation is a big expense. In this city, the monthly rent for a better house is thousands of yuan, which is completely unaffordable for me in my current situation. Now that Roy can help me solve this urgent problem, it couldn't be better. However, I continued, I won't take advantage of you for free. When I have money later, I'll pay you the rent, okay? Roy was a bit surprised when I readily agreed, but after hearing that I wanted to pay the rent, his brows furrowed quickly. But it was just for a moment. In the next second, he nodded to support my decision. I smiled gratefully at him, thanking him for respecting my self-esteem. But, where are you going to earn money? Roy asked. I showed him a mysterious smile and said, I have my own clever plan. Actually, it's not much of a secret. No. Middle school is the best middle school in the city and receives a lot of investments and donations every year. The school uses this investment to set up many awards to encourage students with good academic performance. The amounts are large and the awards are diverse. Among them, the one with the largest amount is for the midterm exam. The first place in the grade will be directly rewarded with 10,000 yuan, the second place with 5,000 yuan, the third place with 2,500 yuan, and so on. Besides, there is also the Best Progress Award with a bonus of 5,000 yuan. It's a pity that such competitions have been monopolized by the elite class all year round, and that 10,000 yuan has always gone into Hank's pocket. I think this time, maybe it's time for me to take the first place in the grade. This is the only way I can think of to make quick money at present. I didn't tell Roy about this. Firstly, I was afraid that if I didn't succeed in the end, I would lose face. Secondly, I was afraid that after Roy knew that I wanted to beat Hank, he would go to pick on Hank every day and prevent him from studying. It's not that I felt sorry for Hank. It's just that this guy likes to play dirty tricks. Roy is too kind and simple to outwit him. There were still 2 months left before the midterm exam. During these 2 months, I worked 10 times harder than I did for the college entrance examination in my previous life. These kids who have never stepped out of the ivory tower will never understand how much potential a social animal who has been tortured by society can burst out when returning to campus. Even Roy couldn't help asking doubtfully, we clearly live under the same roof, but why do I feel like I haven't seen you a few times? I just smiled without saying a word, taking it as a compliment for me. In the last monthly exam before the midterm exam, I controlled my scores. Tall trees catch much wind. I didn't want to attract too much attention yet. I also didn't want to become complacent because of my improved grades in the following time, so I controlled my grades to be among the last few in the class, not much different from my usual scores, but also ensuring that I wouldn't be kicked out of the elite class. However, when I was taking the exam and found that I could answer all the questions, my heart was still pounding with excitement. An indistinct expectation rose in my heart. It was like a general who was already fully equipped, longing for the battlefield. After the results came out, Hank helped distribute the test papers. When he walked to my desk, his expression was pitying, but there was a hint of smugness in his eyes. He sighed and said, "I told you not to be so stubborn. You almost couldn't stay in the elite class this time. I still keep your notes for you. As long as you need them, Hank." I suddenly called out. Probably not expecting that I would call him in such a gentle tone, he was stunned for a moment and replied with a slightly flushed face, I didn't even raise my head and said faintly, "Why don't you go to the orphanage to adopt a child?" Hank was confused. "What? I think you act like a father too much. It suits you." Hank's face turned completely black. He took several deep breaths before calming down and said to me, "Lindsay, don't be so ungrateful. I'd like to see what you'll do in the midterm exam." He wanted to say more, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw Roy enter the classroom. After looking at me a few times, he finally gritted his teeth and walked away. Roy stared at Hank's back and sat down. Frowning, he asked, "Did he come to bother you again?" I shook my head and waved the test paper in my hand. Roy said, "Hey," and snatched the test paper from my hand, laughing, "You did quite well in the exam." He never needed to worry about which class he would be in. After all, even if he got the last place in the whole school, the principal would still keep him respectfully in the elite class for the sake of those buildings. However, if I could improve his grades, maybe his parents wouldn't force him to transfer schools anymore? So I asked, "Where's your test paper?" Roy was stunned for a moment and then said righteously, "I didn't take the exam. I went out to play basketball." The examination rooms were always randomly assigned, so I didn't know that he had skipped the exam. Now it was my turn to be shocked. "Why?" Roy said casually, "It's boring." I didn't want to take it. I fell silent. Alright, it seems that there's a long way to go to improve his grades. Time passed quickly and soon it was the day of the midterm exam. Although the seats were randomly assigned, the teachers deliberately assigned the students from the elite class to the same examination room to prevent the students from the ordinary class from plagiarizing and cheating. So unfortunately, Hank, Joanna, and I were all assigned to the same examination room. They were even sitting on the seats to my left and right. What bad luck, however, after the bell rang, I didn't have the mind to care about these things. Unlike the last monthly exam, this time I gave full play to all my abilities. In my previous life, I always thought that studying was hard and started slacking off after getting into the elite class. If it hadn't been for staying by Hank's side, I'm afraid I would have been kicked out as soon as I got in. But after living this life again, I realized that studying is nothing compared to life. If I don't study hard, I might repeat the same mistakes, might be pestered by scumbags, might be controlled by my family. With this belief, I studied extremely hard during these 2 months. The questions that I couldn't figure out even if I scratched my head in the past have now become a piece of cake for me. As a result, I finished answering the papers half an hour before the end of the exam. I checked the test papers again. Hank just put down his pen and looked at me suspiciously. When the bell rang and the invigilator collected the test papers, the crowd rushed out of the door. Hank squeezed to my side and frowned. The questions were a bit difficult this time. But even if you couldn't do them, you shouldn't give up on yourself. I raised my eyebrows. Difficult? Why didn't I feel that? Hank furrowed his brows even deeper and his tone was full of the superiority of a top student. You might not feel it, but the last few big questions were indeed a bit difficult. The score gap in the school ranking will widen again this time. You. I silently rolled my eyes and walked out of the classroom, brushing past him. I couldn't bear to listen to such confident remarks for one more second. The same was true for the following subjects. I always finished answering half an hour earlier than Hank. After the last exam was over, Hank kept sighing at me. "Well, I'll go and beg Teacher Wang to let you continue to stay in the elite class. How about that?" I smiled. This guy is really strange. In my previous life, would he have thought of pleading for me? No. Because no matter which class I was in, I would shamelessly pester him and like him. But now that I'm treating him like dirt, he keeps sticking to me instead. Even when I mock and dislike him, he still refuses to let go. However, does he really want to help me? Not really. He's just unwilling to accept it. He just wants to regain the feeling of being adored and that superior feeling. I turned my head and gave Hank a perfunctory smile. No thanks. I can't afford it. The midterm exam always has an honor roll. That is to say, the rankings of the whole school are printed out and posted on the bulletin board in the corridor. Because this exam is very important, the teachers finished grading the test papers in just 3 days. On the day when the list was posted, I went to the school store to buy water, but I saw a group of people gathered around the honor roll, talking animatedly. No way. God, Hank actually messed up this time. What's going on? When did things change in the elite class? Stop talking? She's coming. I stood outside the crowd and tiptoed to peek. Unexpectedly, the girl standing in front of me turned her head to look, and immediately looked at me with a very frightened look in her eyes. I don't know who shouted, and then everyone turned their heads one after another, showing the same frightened expressions. After a rustling sound of clothes rubbing against each other, a path was cleared in front of me. Is it that exaggerated? It seemed impolite not to go in now. I walked to the honor roll under everyone's gaze and suddenly widened my eyes. The biggest headline, in the thickest font, clearly read, "First place, Lindsay, I really beat Hank in the exam?" However, that wasn't what shocked me the most. What shocked me the most was that right below my name, it wasn't Hank next. It was Roy. Second place, Roy. Third place, Hank. The once undefeated myth now only took the third place. No wonder it attracted so many onlookers. Especially the ones ahead of him. One was a lovesick girl who transferred into the elite class for love, and the other was a school bully who got into the elite class by relying on money. Move aside. The familiar voice rang out, and I subconsciously turned my head and saw Hank's gloomy face. I turned my head to look at the honor roll again and suddenly found it a bit funny. What he said was actually right. The score gap had indeed widened. Because he was 10 points behind Roy and a full 20 points behind me. Just then, I felt a pain in my wrist, which made me have to turn my head back. Hank had walked in front of me without my knowing. He suddenly grabbed my wrist and said through gritted teeth, "Is this fun for you?" I was baffled. If you're referring to getting the first place in the exam, then it's indeed fun. Knocking you down is really fun. More and more onlookers gathered, almost blocking the entire corridor. At this moment, Hank growled in a low voice that wasn't too loud or too soft, "There should be a limit to cheating. Is a stolen grade useful?" Everyone was in an uproar. This news exploded in the crowd instantly, and the fragmented discussions reached my ears without any disguise. I knew she couldn't possibly get the first place in the exam. Just as I thought. During the exam, Hank seemed to be sitting next to her. He must have seen it. Very likely. She was caught cheating by Hank, yet she shamelessly got the first place. No wonder Hank is so angry. Hearing everyone's condemnation, I sneered. Well, they've even made up the whole process for me. What's your evidence? Hank gritted his back teeth and said gloomily, "Lindsay, you can deceive others but not me. How could you improve so much in just 2 months? Who leaked the questions to you? Was it Roy? That's why he got the second place." There were waves of gasps from the crowd. The discussions grew louder and louder. That explains why they could get the first and second places. Right. Roy's family is so wealthy. It's not impossible for him to bribe the teachers. He bought the answers and then gave them to Lindsay. They're also deskmates. How could both of them improve so much at the same time? There must be something fishy. Now I understand how rumors start. I suddenly broke free from Hank's hand, folded my arms and smiled. Can't you accept the gap all of a sudden? Are you so obsessed with winning or losing that you've gone crazy? Hank, you'd better get used to it as soon as possible, because from now on I'll beat you in every exam. You'd better learn to say goodbye to the first place in the whole school as soon as possible. With that, I was about to leave, but Hank wouldn't let it go and shouted behind me, "You still refuse to admit it, don't you?" I was so angry that I laughed. "Don't just talk. You say I cheated. Where's the evidence?" The crowd was silent for a few seconds and then all looked at Hank. His expression was gloomy, and then he seemed to have made up his mind and shouted, "I saw it with my own eyes, Lindsay. I saw you cheating with my own eyes." In my opinion, Hank is really stupid. He could have said that I memorized the answers in my mind. Cheating? Copying from little notes? That could be checked by looking at the surveillance footage. Until the head teacher said to us with an awkward look on his face, "The cameras in the examination room are broken." I could tell from his evasive eyes that he was trying to protect Hank. After all, Hank was the top student who had always been firmly in the first place. Even if he wasn't this time, he was still the teacher's favorite. So the teacher would rather lie than let people know that Hank had lied out of anger. However, why should I bear the blame for his wrongdoing with my reputation? Without evidence but with a witness, wouldn't that confirm that I cheated? At this time, a lazy voice came from outside the office. Even a small camera breaks down so easily. I'm starting to suspect that my father's investment has been embezzled by the school board. I'm even starting to suspect whether it's worth building another building for the 13th middle school. I turned around in surprise and saw Roy walking out of the crowd of onlookers with his hands in his pockets. The cold sweat on the head teacher's forehead became more obvious. He stammered and asked, "Why are you here?" Roy pouted and said, "Didn't someone say that my hard-earned second place in the exam was obtained by cheating? I'm here to see who's so tired of living." The head teacher wiped his forehead with his sleeve and said sheepishly, I didn't mean you. We're discussing classmate Lindsay's matter now. Oh? Roy smiled. You say she cheated. Then where did her answers come from? The question-setting team consists of famous teachers from the province. How could she have the opportunity to get in touch with them? Isn't the only possibility that she got them from me? The head teacher fell silent. Roy was right. I have neither connections nor money. How could I buy the answers from the teachers on the question-setting team? So the most plausible version that's spreading now is that Roy bribed the teachers and then shared the answers with me. However, taking the blame for me and taking the blame for Roy are two completely different things. I also knew in my heart that Roy was so determined to tie us together because he wanted to use his family's influence to put pressure on the school. For this reason, I gave him a grateful look. The head teacher was sweating more and more. Seeing that it was difficult to make things difficult for us here, he turned to ask Hank, Hank, tell the teacher. Did you really see classmate Lindsay cheating? Maybe you were mistaken. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding? His tone was persuasive as if he was hinting. But things had come to this point, and Hank couldn't possibly back down. He gritted his teeth, lowered his head, and insisted, I saw it with my own eyes. The head teacher was silent. His eyes shifted back and forth between the two groups of people, not knowing what to do for a while. After all, he had already said that the camera was broken. If he changed his mind and said it was fixed now, his face of covering up before and currying favor now would be completely exposed. He definitely couldn't let his dignity as a teacher be lost. Hank also grasped this point, so he held on tightly and refused to let go. Just when the situation was at a stalemate, a clear female voice suddenly came from the doorway, I can testify. Joanna walked into the office step by step, and my heart sank little by little. How could I forget about her? She and Hank were sitting on either side of me during the exam. If she now sided with Hank and said that I cheated, then I really wouldn't be able to clear my name even if I jumped into the Yellow River. Roy seemed to see what was on my mind and hooked my little finger where no one could see, don't panic. I don't know if this consolation had an effect, but my heart calmed down as expected. On the contrary, Hank's eyes were shining brightly as if he was certain that Joanna would help him. The head teacher asked, Joanna, what are you going to testify? Joanna looked at Hank, then at me, and finally took a deep breath as if mustering up her courage and said, I can testify that classmate Lindsay didn't cheat. Huh? 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 I was confused. Hank was also confused. He was the first to react. He was so anxious that he took a step forward and grabbed Joanna's clothes, shouting, What are you talking about? Roy's eyes narrowed, and he went up and directly grabbed Hank's collar, forcing him to keep backing away. The scene was a bit chaotic, and in the middle was also mixed with the voice of the head teacher, the peacemaker, Hey, don't fight. Joanna seemed to be frightened. Her little face was as pale as paper. But she still forced herself to walk to my side and said, At that time, I was sitting next to classmate Lindsay. She answered the questions very quickly. I was a bit surprised and took a few more looks. I can guarantee that throughout the whole exam, she definitely didn't take out any notes, let alone cheated. After she finished speaking, the whole office was silent. Only the classmates watching outside the door suddenly burst out with a boo sound. Hank was still feebly trying to argue, they're all in cahoots. The head teacher rubbed his temples with a headache and said to me, You three can leave first. Hank, you stay. Walking out of the door, I said to Joanna, Thank you. Joanna turned her face away. Her expression was a bit embarrassed, but her tone was still firm, Don't thank me. I'm just telling the truth. Besides, now I also understand that a person like Hank isn't worth my liking at all. However, she changed the topic and looked at me, I still dislike you. With that, she raised her neck and turned around and left in front of us. Looking at her back, I smiled bitterly as if I finally understood why Hank was so infatuated with her in my previous life. Roy stretched out his hand and waved it in front of my eyes a few times. What are you looking at? I came back to my senses and shook my head. Nothing. I just think, she's braver than me. The school's punishment for Hank was to issue a notice of criticism and record the demerit in his file. The matter of slandering others would become a stain on him for the rest of his life. I knew that the school's drastic action was due to Roy's efforts. However, after the Hank incident came to an end, it was my turn to interrogate Roy. I folded my arms and squinted my eyes. You could rank second in the whole school. Why did you pretend to have poor grades before? Roy shrugged. Didn't I tell you? It was boring. I didn't want to take the exams. So it was because the questions were too simple that he thought it was boring? Roy continued, After you asked me about my grades last time, I thought I'd amaze everyone and make you admire me. Unexpectedly, Lindsay, I still couldn't outperform you. I smiled and said, Sorry. This time, you'll have to admire me instead. Roy looked at me, his eyes bright. I've always admired you, classmate Lindsay. I don't know if this incident hit Hank too hard. He stopped bothering my life, but he didn't focus on his studies either. His grades got worse day by day and even dropped out of the top 10 in the grade. Once a favored son who had never suffered setbacks failed, he might face such a dispirited outcome. Well, even in this life, he's atoning for what he did in the previous life. I deservedly received a bonus of 10,000 yuan. I took out half of it and paid it to Roy as rent. He didn't decline and accepted it readily. By the way, he also introduced me to a tutoring job, 4 hours a week, with an hourly wage of 100 yuan, which was enough for my weekly living expenses. I didn't hesitate either and accepted his kindness. Life went on smoothly like this. I never slackened off in my studies, so my grades remained stable. Roy still skipped exams from time to time, but no one said that he got into the elite class by spending money anymore. I don't know what agreement he reached with his parents, but in this life he didn't transfer schools and stayed in middle school all the time. When we entered senior 3, Roy finally got serious about his studies. He was already smart. Besides, due to his family background, he had been taught by the best teachers in the country since childhood, so he firmly held the second place in the grade. Of course, I was the first. And every time I ranked first, what Hank had done to me would be brought up again, and he would be ridiculed and taunted. The sentence, "I will defeat you in every exam," also became a lingering nightmare for him. Perhaps unable to bear the criticism from his classmates, Hank chose to study at home by himself 1 month before the college entrance examination. As for Joanna, in this life she saw Hank's true face early and took back her feelings in time. Several times I bumped into them in the corridor. Hank always stared at her with a hesitant look on his face, while Joanna walked past him without changing her expression. So, Hank, you see, the situation has changed. Those who betrayed others' true feelings didn't swallow 1,000 needles, but they also got their just deserts. On the day the admission notices came out, Roy and I were admitted to the same university. There was no melodramatic plot where one gave up a better life for the other. Because we were both equally excellent, we were both admitted to the best university in the province. As for Hank, I heard that he failed in the college entrance examination and went to a university whose name I had never even heard of. Joanna was sent abroad by her family. I remembered that in the previous life, she also cut off contact with Hank after going abroad. If this were a fairy tale, it should end here. Good people are rewarded, and bad people are punished. However, the princess in the fairy tale didn't have a blood-sucking original family, so my story continued. After entering the university, Roy and I got together. My parents somehow got the news that I had caught a rich husband and rushed to my university overnight to find me. When the counselor called me to the office, I was still in a daze. Who would have thought that as soon as I entered the door, my mother rushed over and hugged me tightly, smearing her snot and tears all over me. "Lindsay, how cruel you are. You just abandoned your parents like this. Think about it. You haven't been home for years. Your parents have been looking for you so hard." After I came to my senses, I was both angry and amused. Looking for me? When I ran away from home, I met Roy 20 meters away from the door. I stood there for half an hour, but I didn't see you come out to look for me. And now you're putting on an act here? The counselor didn't know the truth and thought that I was an unfilial daughter who had run away from home against my parents' wishes, so her expression was a bit serious. She said, "Lindsay, if you have any problems, you should communicate with your parents properly. Look at them. They're old and have come such a long way to find you. How hard it is for them." I pursed my lips and smiled, with a bit of apology on my face. "Sorry, teacher. It was my thoughtlessness that caused you trouble. I'll take my parents out to settle them down first. Goodbye, teacher." Seeing that I was sincere, the counselor didn't say anything more. She just waved her hand and said, "All right. I'll give you 2 days off. Spend these 2 days with your parents well." I nodded repeatedly and pushed the two of them out of the office. Until we walked out of the office, my parents were still in a daze. They wanted to make a big scene in front of the counselor to intimidate me. And then say something like, "Believe it or not, I'll make you famous in the whole school," to blackmail me for money. I've known them for over 20 years. Don't I know what they're thinking? They probably didn't expect that instead of arguing with them, I would dismiss the teacher with just a few words. As soon as the office door closed, my mother seemed to wake up and wanted to bypass me to grab the door handle again. "No. Let's make it clear in front of the teacher." I pressed her hand firmly and said with a forced smile, "If you dare to go in, I won't give you a penny." My father came up and slapped my hand away. "You ungrateful wretch. What do you think of me and your mother?" I ignored the burning pain on the back of my hand and looked up coldly at my biological father. "You can go in and make a big fuss, but open your eyes wide and see if I'm still the obedient daughter who let you manipulate me as you liked a few years ago. While I can still talk to you nicely, leave here with me." Even the executioner who once held the axe high would grow old one day. When he gets old, that's when the axe will be placed on his neck. Our eyes met, and it was a silent confrontation. After a while, the executioner finally gave in. My father lowered his voice and turned to my mother and said, "Let's go. Let's talk outside." In the private room of the coffee shop at the school gate, the middle-aged woman was shedding crocodile tears while the man beside her frowned and didn't say a word. "Your brother took money from us, saying he wanted to study. But when we asked the teacher, we found out that he didn't go to school at all. He went gambling instead, 30,000 yuan. He spent it all in a month. When he came back, he was in debt up to his neck. The first time, we paid off the debt for him, and he knelt down and promised that he would never do it again. But a month later, the creditors came to our door. 100,000 yuan, Lindsay. Your father and I took out all our savings. That money was originally reserved for your brother to marry a wife." At this point, she almost burst into loud sobs. I don't know if she was feeling sorry for her son or the daughter-in-law who hadn't even entered the door and suffered yet. "If it weren't for having no other choice, your father and I wouldn't have come to you. We're really desperate." I frowned slightly. "Did you sell your house and car?" The crying stopped abruptly. Both of them looked up at me in shock. I continued calmly, "It seems you didn't. Is this really being desperate?" My father seemed to have been hit where it hurt. In a state of extreme guilt, he became furious instead. "You ungrateful wretch. What do you mean? Do I have to be homeless with your mother before I can come to you? Do you want me as your father to kneel down and beg you?" "All right," I interrupted him, speaking word by word, "a promise is a promise. Kneel down then. Who can't say nice words? Who are you trying to morally kidnap here? Okay. You've grown up and become disobedient." His face turned red and then pale, and finally he sat down with a dark face. I changed to a more comfortable sitting position and smiled lightly. "You keep saying you want me to help, but I'm just a college student. Where can I get the money?" The couple looked at each other for a few times, and there was a bit of silence. After a while, my mother forced a smile and said, "Lindsay, don't hide it from us. Your father and I have heard that the young master of Roy's family group is in a relationship with you. Isn't that right?" "Sure enough." The smile on my lips turned cold. "But we're just dating. Why should I ask him for money?" When my mother heard this, she thought there was hope and quickly continued as if pushing me onto the stage. "Why can't you ask him for money? It's just 100,000 yuan. It's nothing to him. This is your own brother." My father, who had been silent all this time, snorted coldly and arrogantly said in a posture of a controller, "Besides, if he wants to marry you in the future, the betrothal gifts will be more than 100,000 yuan. What's wrong with taking a little in advance? He's already slept with my daughter, Silas." I slammed the table hard and lost my temper for the first time today. Even though I had been prepared in my heart, I still couldn't believe that such words could come out of my biological father's mouth. In his eyes, his daughter was a bargaining chip for wealth and a tool to save his son. But not a living and dignified person. Seeing that I was angry, his voice became a bit quieter, but he still looked dissatisfied. "Why are you shouting? I'm not wrong." I rubbed my forehead and said, "I don't have money, and I definitely won't ask Roy for it. But since you've come all this way, it's not easy. You can stay in my apartment for 2 days first and then think about what to do for my brother." Hearing the first half of the sentence, the two of them wanted to continue to get angry. But after hearing the second half, my mother grabbed my father's sleeve and shook her head secretly. Looking at their little actions, I secretly laughed to myself in my heart. If you hadn't come to find me today, it would have been a good thing if we went our separate ways and had nothing to do with each other. But I know you won't let this cash cow go. So, no matter what happens in the future, don't blame me. Since sometimes I would be tutoring until very late and often missed the curfew, I simply rented an apartment outside the school. As soon as my mother entered the door, she began to sigh in a sour tone. "Your younger brother is living a life of hiding here and there in our hometown, while you're living comfortably." I didn't put up with her and retorted directly, "Did I force him to gamble? Did I make him hide?" Sometimes people are like this. When you are obedient, they will become even more excessive. Once you lose your temper, then it's the other person who will shut up obediently. After I said this, my mother immediately shut her mouth. My father just lay down on the sofa, crossed his legs, looked at the photo of me and Roy on the coffee table and said, "I never expected that I, Silas, would one day become the father-in-law of the Roy family group. When are you going to bring this boy to show us?" I sneered inwardly. Don't even think about it. But I still said with my mouth, "When I have time." At this time, my mother, who was looking around, suddenly pointed at a safe and asked, "What's inside?" I raised my head in a panic and said, "Nothing." The couple looked at each other, and my father gave me a meaningful look. "You've grown up and started to hide things from your parents." I didn't respond. In these few days, I was busy with classes while my parents stayed in the apartment, eating and drinking. Occasionally when they saw me, they would ask me to find a way to raise money for my younger brother. One day, as soon as I entered the door, I saw the dining table full of gift bags. My heart tightened and suddenly I felt that something was wrong. My mother was holding a luxury bag in her hand and greeted me with a smile. "Lindsay, look at this bag. Isn't it nice? Roy specially picked it for Mom." The string in my mind finally snapped. I rushed forward and grabbed her arm, gritted my teeth and said, "Did you go to see Roy?" My mother shook off my hand and had an indifferent expression. "Ah, since you refused to help your younger brother, your father and I could only go to beg our future son-in-law. You don't even know how magnificent that building and that office are. TSK, tisk. I had planned for so long, just wanting to deal with these messy things in my original family by myself. But I never expected that they would shamelessly go to ask Roy for money." I took a deep breath and said, "Let's go and return these things to him." "What are you talking about?" My father quickly walked over, pulled my mother away and said condescendingly to me, "These are all the filial piety of the younger generation to the elders. There's no reason to return them." I was so angry that I said, "If you don't return them, get out of my house today." Hearing this, my mother immediately sat down on the ground and cried, "There's no justice. We raised you up so big. I never expected that one day I would be driven out of the house by my own daughter." I was so angry that my head started to feel dizzy. I couldn't imagine what unpleasant and vulgar words they might have said to Roy. What's more, I couldn't imagine how Roy would think of me now. "Uncle and Aunt, what are you doing?" Suddenly, a male voice came from behind me. I quickly turned around and met Roy's face with a smile and confusion. It's okay, it's okay." Seeing Roy coming, my mother quickly got up from the ground, patted her clothes and said with a dry laugh, "I was just joking with Lindsay. You're here. Come in and sit down quickly." I lowered my head, looked at his leather shoes and bit my lip. How embarrassing. I just felt an unprecedented sense of embarrassment. I clearly wanted to handle things well by myself. I clearly didn't want him to look down on me. "Let's go." A warm hand put around my shoulder and pushed me towards the living room. "Don't cry now. The good show hasn't started yet." I suddenly raised my head. What did that mean? I put 30,000 yuan in the safe in my apartment. My original plan was to let them notice this sum of money and then pry open the lock and steal it. I installed a pet camera in the living room. When I had the physical evidence in hand, I could threaten to call the police and force them to disappear from my world. But I didn't expect that Roy would be involved in the middle. My parents walked in front, busy cutting fruits and wiping the table. They were trying their best to make a good impression on Roy so as to keep this wealthy son-in-law. However, he was behind and whispered to me in a voice that only the two of us could hear, "You've prepared so much. Why did you leave me out?" I was surprised and asked, "Did you know all about it?" Roy raised his eyebrows. "I guessed it from the day you bought the safe. Who would choose such an old-fashioned and not so sturdy safe? Unless they deliberately wanted someone to pry it open. There's clearly no pet in the family but you bought a camera." I was still wondering why. "It wasn't until your counselor told me that your parents came to see you that everything made sense." I suddenly felt relieved. Fortunately, he guessed it, and thank you for guessing it. He didn't look down on me because of this, and there was no estrangement between us because of this. More importantly, I finally didn't have to bear such a painful thing alone. I suddenly asked in confusion, "Since you knew everything, why did you give them gifts?" Roy smiled mysteriously and held me tighter. "I know you're willing to do anything to get rid of them, but I still don't want you to bear the reputation of reporting your own parents. So leave it to me." I stared blankly at his face. Moved, surprised, complicated. All kinds of emotions surged in my chest. In the end, it just turned into one sentence: "Okay, I believe you." In these few days, my parents clearly regarded the building of the Roy family group as their own home. They went there every few days. Every time they came back, they always brought back a bunch of luxury gifts. They even started to plan how to marry me into the Roy family earlier so that they could get that considerable betrothal gift. Although I felt annoyed, but for the sake of Roy's plan, I had been enduring it all the time. Until one day, I saw a USB flash drive on the coffee table in the living room. It looked out of place among the other luxury items. "What's this?" I picked it up and looked at it and asked. Who knew that my mother rushed forward and snatched the USB flash drive back in a panic and said, "Nothing. I bought it myself." I thought to myself, you don't even know how to turn on a computer. Do you have any data that needs to be stored in a USB flash drive? Could it be that you stole it from Roy's office? I held back my emotions, walked aside, took out my phone and typed, "USB flash drive." Roy replied quickly, "Yes." I understood it in my heart. After so many days, the good show was finally about to start. The next day, Roy's assistant came to the door. "Oh, isn't this Miss Chen?" My mother was just about to greet him, but who knew that Xiao Chen rushed past her in a panic. "Miss Lindsay, the boss asked me to come and ask you if you've seen such a thing." He took out his phone, and on the screen was exactly the USB flash drive I saw yesterday. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw that my mother's expression instantly became stiff. I didn't answer but asked instead, "What happened?" Xiao Chen wiped the cold sweat on his forehead and said, "There are our company's business secrets in it." It has been carefully kept in the boss's office all the time. Who knew that it suddenly disappeared when we were going to have a meeting today? The boss asked me to come and ask if it was left in your home. As soon as he finished speaking, my mother couldn't wait to interrupt. Then, is it very important? Xiaochen said, of course it's important, auntie. It's a project worth hundreds of millions. If our competitors get it, it will be completely ruined. My mother's face suddenly turned pale and she couldn't say a word. I'll look for it. I'll contact Roy if I find it. You can go back first, I said to Xiaochen. After he left, I turned around and asked, was the thing you took home yesterday the USB flash drive that Roy lost? My mother nodded in panic, yes. Where is it now? I gave it to someone. I suddenly raised my voice, what did you say? My mother patted her chest and gave me an unhappy look, why are you shouting so loudly? It's just that. Your father and I met a young man these 2 days. When he heard that I was Roy's mother-in-law, he asked me if I could take that thing out and show it to him. I was almost driven crazy by her stupidity, just because he asked you for it, you gave it to him. Don't you know this is called stealing? He paid for it. 200,000 yuan. You said that your younger brother's matter hasn't been settled yet. Roy has given a lot of gifts these 2 days, but he never gave cash. I can't sell the bag to save your younger brother, right? What's more, with this 200,000 yuan, half can be used to pay off the debts, and the other half can be used to buy a car for your younger brother. How nice it is. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath before I could hold back the swear words that were coming to my throat. Why can't you sell the bag? Clearly, you want both the bag and the cash. In the final analysis, it's just 2 words, vanity. At this time, my father was also attracted by the noise. He still put on airs and gave orders like a superior, it's just what's that disc? Just get it back from that person. It's not a big deal. Why are you arguing here? I held my forehead and sighed, didn't you hear what Xiaochen just said? There are business secrets in it. Even if the USB flash drive is taken back, the things inside must have been completely copied by others. It means that hundreds of millions of yuan will be wasted. Do you know that? When it's found out that you stole it, you'll be reported to the police and sent to prison. Do you know that? Hearing the word prison, my mother immediately collapsed on the sofa and murmured, how could it be so serious? This. Suddenly, she rushed towards me, Lindsay, you have to save mom and dad. Your younger brother is still in trouble. We can't go to prison. You go and beg Roy. You go? I showed a helpless expression, for such a big project, it's not something that Roy can decide by just saying a word. Above him, there are his father and the board of directors. I grabbed her wrist and said, Mom, come with me to turn yourself in. Maybe you can get out earlier. Impossible. My mother pushed me away, turn myself in? Are you crazy? She then turned her eyes to my father, old man, say something. We can't go to prison. Who knew that my usually irritable father was unusually quiet this time? He sighed and said to me, this matter is our parents' fault. If we're wrong, we have to admit it. But we really don't have the face to see Roy again. Well, is it convenient for you to go and invite him over now? Mom and Dad will apologize to him face to face. As for what happens later, we'll let him handle it. As soon as he finished speaking, my mother showed an incredulous expression, Silas, are you crazy? I don't want to go to prison even if you do. I'm so old. If I go in, I might die in there. Why should I? Slap. A slap was clear and loud. My father pointed at my mother who was slapped and fell to the ground and cursed, in front of our daughter, we can't dare to do something but not dare to admit it. Just consider it as the last lesson we give her. Not wanting to continue watching this farce, I turned around and grasped the doorknob. Well, okay, I'll go to find Roy and bring him here right now. It was 2 hours later when I got home again. I ordered takeout in Roy's office and boiled a pot of tea. Finally, I took him home unhurriedly. As soon as I opened the door, sure enough, there was no one left. They were so worried that they didn't even have time to pry open the safe, which saved me 30,000 yuan for nothing. Sure enough, you know them well and guessed that they would run away. I chuckled with a bit of teasing and emotion. I'm afraid from now on, they will avoid me like the plague and will never come to cause trouble on their own initiative again. What about that USB flash drive? Is it okay? Roy shook his head, it's okay. There's false information in it. If the Liu family believes it's true, it will be beneficial to us instead. I smiled and said, President Roy has killed 2 birds with 1 stone this time. What a good strategy. Roy raised his eyebrows, are you very much in awe of me? On his still unrestrained and flamboyant face, I seemed to see the teenager from many years ago. I said, I always have been, classmate Roy.